So we have here with us today Christoper Lind. I met Christoper during one of my first TLDC casts. He was being interviewed and discussed during the interview how he had been a prior teacher. And I just really felt a connection with him to be able to want to talk to him further. We had a prior conversation just about his experience in general. And now that I'm creating videos, which was part of his recommendation as well when we talked before, I wanted to get him on here and be able to share his experience with people. I've had some really great feedback of some people coming in saying that these videos are helpful. So I figured who better, Chris would be a great person for us to talk to a little further. So Christoper, if there's anything you want to say, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and get started.
No, just I'm happy to be here, and I remember it's crazy to think it's been a while since we had that first conversation. So here we are again, and doing this. So it's awesome. I think it's great.
Yes, it's amazing how these online relationships, especially this video, is very helpful to be able to. And I follow you on LinkedIn and love all this stuff. So if anybody listening, you need to follow him on LinkedIn if you're not already doing so, and we'll get to that in a little while. So,
sounds good.
So Christoper, can you tell us how you got into teaching and what kind of made you want to make that shift out?
Yeah, so when I first went off to college, I actually thought I was going to be a software engineer. Everybody said, you're really good at math, you're big into computers, you should do that because that's the future, and that's what you really are good at. And I don't know, I was 17, you don't know any difference. You're like, okay, fine. And I started getting into it, and it was easy. I did it, but I hated it. I'm like, I enjoy this as like a hobby. I enjoy it as a side thing, but I can't stand it. And I'll tell you what I later discovered I actually liked about it. But then I'm like, well, now what do I do? Like software engineering, hate it. Now what? And so I had a mentor who said, well, just whatever you do, pick something that has to do with people and that has really good transferable people skills. And so I was like, okay, like whatever that means. And then another high school mentor of mine said, hey, you've always been a coach. Like you've always coached people in everything. Anything you've done, you've always coached and helped people. So why don't you go into teaching? You could do that. So I'm like, okay, fine. Like, I guess why not? There's nothing else to do. So I did, and I actually really enjoyed it. I did all my stuff. I was going to be an 8th grade math teacher. I did for a little bit. But what I discovered after going through all my student teaching and just kind of getting my feet wet was like, this isn't really like I like coaching, teaching in the traditional academic sense. I just am not feeling it. And honestly, the parents drove me nuts. That probably was my biggest beef. I love the kids. It was the parents that just made me be like, oh, this is not for me.
And now where you're in Wisconsin.
Yep.
So were you teaching in Wisconsin? Is that where all of this took place?
No, I was in the Twin Cities. So I went to Northwestern in the Twin Cities and did all my student teaching there, and then taught for a little bit in that area. And then I moved all over the place. But yeah, now I'm in Wisconsin.
Okay. So you're teaching, and the teacher, the adults, parents are not
for me.
So great.
Yeah.
What wasn't exactly what you expected or wanted to deal with, I guess. So what then made you want to leave? What did you get into when you left? And how was that process of you doing that? How did you feel during that time, and how did you go about all that?
It wasn't smooth, right? So, some people think like, oh, you have this like smooth transition into this, and it wasn't. Like I just literally pulled the ripcord and was like, I'm out, like I'm done. This isn't for me. And it was tough because, and I've mentioned this analogy, it felt like a doctor going to med school and deciding not to be a doctor. Like I went to school to be a teacher, and I wasn't a teacher anymore. And like, I have literally no clue what to do with this. So I kind of actually was mad at my mentor. I'm like, you said if I had people skills, this would be easy. And so I'm like, I don't know. So literally, I think I did what a lot of people do when they don't know what to do. People are like, well, you're dynamic, go into sales. I'm like, okay, I guess sales. So I started looking for sales jobs, and it didn't go super well, but I ended up landing one. Not my proudest moment. So from 8th grade math teaching, I landed a sales territory management job for Camel cigarettes. Um, yeah, quite the shift, which, like I said, not my proudest moment, but it actually was a turning point for me because one of the things, because I had my teaching background, uh, not long into my tenure there, they just said, hey, we're really bad at onboarding employees. We're terrible at it. We just kind of bring them in and throw them in and they either sink or swim. And you're a teacher-ish person. Can you help us with that? And that was literally it. I went, wait a minute, what? And that's when I realized, like, wait, there's a whole nother world of teaching in a completely different, and that was honestly my light bulb moment where I went, oh, okay, well, now I know what I'm going to do. And I still didn't really know what that looked like, but I knew, okay, now I'm going to figure out what this is.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about the moment where you get into that role and you're hearing maybe these terms, and because I know a lot of teachers, and I was in that position where you there's terms being thrown around, you don't know what they are, and like eventually you might have that realization moment that's like, it's very different, but yet it's very similar. And can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, the corporate lingo is probably one of the biggest barriers for former teachers, is because they think, oh, this, I actually was talking to a former teacher friend of mine the other day who listened in on an HCI webcast I was on. And she's like, I'd never heard of digital transformation of upskilling employees. And I'm like, okay, that's because that's the corporate speak for training employee. Like that's, like that's all it is. So it was an adjustment. And that's where, as I got into it, I started connecting with other people in the field and just said, help me understand, like, what are they talking about? Because as corporate, and we honestly, as a teacher, we had the same stuff, right? We had the same lingo in teaching. You talk about all this stuff that sounds really unique and complex. And you're like, oh, that's all that is, like an individual plan for a kid. Oh, IEP, I get it. So I think that's where it was just about learning what that translation was. And I just surrounded myself with people who were in it. And that helped me start to get it, if you will. Okay. It is all the same. It's honestly all the same.
Yeah. So in regards to connecting with people and surrounding yourself with them, how did you go about connecting with them? I know a lot of people maybe don't have the confidence, or they're scared to ask questions, or they don't think they're worthy. And so what did you do, and how did you go about finding those people to connect and build those relationships with, to feel confident to ask?
Yeah. So for me, I actually am extremely introverted, which most people don't think when they meet me. They're like, no, you're not. I'm like, I actually am. So that was a barrier I had to work through, because I was more, kind of like not comfortable with that. Now over the years, I've figured it out, but that's where, and I didn't have this luxury back then. Now, if I was me, 16 years ago, I would have immersed myself in LinkedIn. I did internet research. Internet was getting big then. And so I was just like, I'm going to look this up. Like that's where I figured out, like, what are the job titles that are kind of education train. Like I started researching about that and started reading about, then I realized, like, okay, so HR is kind of a thing. I started doing that. So I really did a lot of my own research long before I even started connecting with people. Because again, I was shy. I didn't want to sound like I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I at least wanted to be able to kind of speak the language. But again, if I had LinkedIn back then, I would have just completely dove into that. I just didn't have that luxury. It didn't exist.
So considering that people now that might be watching this do have LinkedIn, and I know most teachers, at least when I was, and most teachers that I am running into, they either don't have LinkedIn or they just kind of started and they don't know how to set up their profile, which I have a session, another session with AT Higher Ed Gig I did. I forgot, it's not with this. But in regards to setting up your profile, in regards to connecting with people, do you recommend they get involved with groups on LinkedIn, or just connect with people and follow conversations, or post their own stuff? What do you recommend?
So I will say, just like with students, every person's an individual. So everybody's journey is going to be their own, right? You kind of have to figure out what's your comfort level, what are you good at, and things like that. But I can give you some experiences that I had that I think would be really helpful. One of the biggest mistakes I think I see people make with LinkedIn is they treat it like Facebook. So they only connect with people that they know, because that's what you do with Facebook. It's like, well, I'm only supposed to be connected with people I know. And that's actually the opposite for LinkedIn. LinkedIn is designed to expand your network, to help you connect with people outside your comfort zone and things like that. And so that's a little bit of a, that's a little bit of a like, wait, what? Like, I don't know this person. Should I really be connected to them? And the answer to that is yes. And you can tell them that. People, I've been amazed as I've connected with more and more people. People love to connect with other people as long as they feel like, you're not just coming to them wanting something. If you're coming to learn from them or say, hey, like that's where, I would tell people just write a little, change your personalization message instead of just spamming the invite thing. But if you just say, hey, I'm a teacher looking to learn more about the corporate side of education, I can promise you almost nobody's going to say no thanks. And if it takes a while for people to respond, it's just because not everybody's as active on LinkedIn as some of us. So some people are just going to be like, not there, but nobody's going to be like, no, you jerk. Like, I don't want you to follow people will totally be open to it. So I think that's a good starting point. If you like getting into groups, you can. I mean, podcasts are a great way to do it. For me, the thing that I literally, I mean, what we're doing here, minus the recording and posting it part, like reaching out to people and saying, hey, do you want to get a virtual coffee? I don't think I've ever had anyone say, no, I'm not interested. And so I've built relationships and just ask questions. And if you're curious, people will sense if it's like, hey, I'm doing this, I'm reaching out because I want a job. Like, you might get a little more like, well, I'm kind of busy. But if it's just like, no, I'm just trying to learn. I want to learn from your background, your experience, just understand the space. I think you'll be hard pressed to find somebody that just flat up says, no, I don't want to help.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because I know myself, I am more than willing to help those people. Well, I am a prior teacher, as you and many other people that are in these groups that I've started networking with in regards to prior teacher groups, and everybody is always more than willing to help. And I think just that simple message of, hey, can I pick your brain one day? Can we have a phone call? Can we, do a video call like this? There's so much opportunity out there to learn. And I know for me, getting involved in ATD was huge, because I was able to ask so many questions. Like you said, I didn't have the confidence initially to ask the questions, but I heard things they were talking about. And then once I got to know them well enough, like I would maybe go research on my own, like you said. And then once I had enough confidence, then I'd start talking to them about it.
Yes. Well, and that's where I think you have to find your comfort level of vulnerability. But the biggest thing I encourage people is like, be vulnerable. Even, I mean, I've been doing this my whole career now and run it for GE. And I still will go to people and be like, I don't know, can you help me? And that's something a lot of people are, we've grown up being like, no, you're supposed to know it. Like, you're an adult now. Nonsense. Like, honestly, that's nonsense. Now I have a pretty comfortable level of risk, so I have no problem. I don't even do the pre-research anymore. I'll just go in, head first and be like, I don't know anything about this. Can you help? But if that's not who you are, like, you can Google it. You can find enough to at least get a baseline of it, and go ask. People are super nice. Honestly, people are, and you know what? The bad eggs you run into that aren't, whatever. Just move on. There will be 99 for every one that you hit that, gives you a hard time.
Right. So now, so you got into L&D through the sales position. And I've actually heard somebody say that they recommend you just get a job anywhere, and then you'll eventually weave your way into training and development. Would you think that's, from your experience, but what do you think about that?
Yeah. So because the thing was with me, so I had that experience at Camel, and then the project ended and they just put me back. So they didn't even see like, oh, this is a skill set you have. They're just like, great, we got onboarding back to so I quit. I'm like, no, I can't sell cigarettes after realizing what I want to do. Like, no way. So I guess you could go two ways. One, you could get a job doing kind of anything, but you might be miserable with it, right? So you might go into it and be like, wow, this really stinks. Because what happened is, it actually took me 2 leaps before I really went. So I quit Camel, literally, like, I thought I pulled the ripcord from teaching. I really pulled the ripcord from RJ. probably biggest career mistake I ever made. I just literally one day just said, I quit, and I had no plans for anything. So I ended up moving into another role, which again was a little bit of a guiding role. It was a sales role, but it was customer support. So I was more so, it was telecommunications too. So my whole job was to help companies implement these smartphones. It was right at the time when they were going to smartphones, and it was this digital transformation. Everybody was resisting it, which is hard to believe now. But at the time, people were like, I don't want email on my phone. And so it was, again, kind of this change management thing. So I think that was just dumb luck that I ended up in this hybrid role. But it was then at that point where I said, no, I want to do this. Like, this is what I want to do. I'm not going to play this kind of hybrid game or try and get a job and then convince them that I've got a skill set. So it was just brute force. I was broke. I was sitting in the parking lot of a bank getting Wi-Fi because I couldn't afford Wi-Fi at night. And I literally just applied to any job with the word train. So I looked up entry-level education roles, and I learned training specialist, instructional designer, training coordinator, and anything that even remotely sounded like that, I applied to. And it was just a numbers game. I just hammered until someone would listen. And the biggest thing was I perfected my story of how being a teacher translated into this. And that was the biggest thing, because people had a hard time seeing it. They're like, but you taught 8th graders. So I'm not seeing how adults, they're so different. And you're like, no, they're not. But I had to tell that story. And so that's, like, if I was to give somebody advice who's looking at making that transition, get really good at telling that story of, hey, these are the skills I did. This is what you're trying to do. This is how I can help solve those problems. Because that's just through tons and tons of interviews. I got good at that story. And finally, a software company took me up on it. They said, okay, it sounds like a pretty compelling story. You want to fly around and train people on medical software? Go for it. And that was where I really took a full-time training role. And I mean, then it took off like a rocket from there. Because once you're in, then you're in. You can stop trying to sell the story or explain the transferable skills. And that's honestly the toughest part, which is why sometimes taking just anything and then just trying to move in can be really frustrating, because the longer you're in the workforce in a different role, then you got to explain, well, why are you looking to make a shift? Well, I've been trying for years to get into training. It gets almost harder to do it. Not saying you can't, but it can be harder.
Very good point. I like that perspective. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So now, what are you up to now? So, and if you want to share a little about your transition from where you were at the software training role to now, would love that, an overview.
I can give you the story that how it's kind of taken off. So this goes back to the other thing I discovered, right? So when I was in school, I discovered I didn't want to be a software engineer, didn't want to build tech. But what I realized that I loved about tech was I was fascinated by the way it was changing human behavior. I was fascinated by the fact that, we were being able to, and this was way back then when really the internet wasn't doing much, but it was starting to. And I was fascinated by the things that we were being able to do with people that we couldn't before, the way we could reach them, the way we could connect, the way we could, change human behavior. And so that kind of started to merge with this whole education thing. And so when I was in the software company, we were flying people all over the place, and it worked. But I started speaking up and saying, we can do better. We can do better than this. 1, this is a terrible instructional approach. 2, this is a terrible technology approach. And they finally got annoyed with me saying it. And they said, fine, you figure it out then. And they asked me to set up the instructional design COE. And so I built that out, and I brought in technology and said, no, this is how we're going to implement clients. We're going to do it virtually, and we're going to minimize how much time we're on site, because we know that's not effective. And so that grew. And then they said, you need to move to Wallingford, Connecticut. And I'm like, absolutely not. So I left and I went into higher education, and I worked with a higher education company, initially teaching all their internal admissions and academic staff on onboarding and things like that. But then because of my background and the transformation I was doing with them, because before we used to fly everybody to Chicago, and I said, this is dumb. We're not doing that anymore. And all of a sudden the higher ed people started going, well, that's interesting. Can you help us work with our professors and our academic staff? And so I started working with them on, how do you really have an engaging virtual classroom? How do you be more dynamic with that versus just hammering through PowerPoint? And so I did that. And then that industry was not doing so well. So a pharma company, I got to connect it in through somebody. And again, I think a lot of my experiences were just through brute force. I wanted to get into healthcare. And so every healthcare company I could find, I tried telling my story of what it was. And the head of regulatory at AbbVie Pharmaceuticals had been trying to change the way they developed their employees forever. And they'd kept hiring regulatory people, because this is the challenge that teachers will face, is people will say, well, you don't have industry experience. You don't understand the industry, and how can you do it? And my story was always, that's perfect, because my job is to ask the right questions. And what I know how to do is I know how to construct the way you get people to accomplish what you want to accomplish. I don't need to know the industry, because you're going to help me with that, but I know how to build the stuff. And so I had this regulatory executive who just kind of looked at me and he's like, you don't know pharma, you don't know regulatory. I just don't know how this is going to work. And I remember saying, well, worse it happens, you hire me and it doesn't work, but I think it will. I can help upskill the teams. And so he said, okay. And I did. And so it was an amazing experience. We just transformed the whole global experience, did a culture transformation. I learned so much. That's where I really started learning more about talent management, and what the whole HR side of the house was. Even though I wasn't in HR, I worked closely with them. And so I did that for a long time, or several years. And then I got a new leader and he was not so nice. And I just said, I just don't want to do this anymore. And it just so happened at that time, GE called and said, we do a ton of education, but we've been doing it the same way for 100 years. Would you come help us figure it out? And so now I've had a couple shifts here at GE, but now I'm in charge of global digital learning for all of GE Healthcare.
So what exactly does that mean, in charge of global healthcare learning? What do you do on a daily basis, or what does your team do on a daily basis that a teacher might, be interested in or want to hear and learn more about?
So a big part, so the digital side of it, and this was really the selling point for me coming into GE. This is how I sold them on it, because we did a lot of what I call education, which teachers would be very familiar with this. The way GE had historically done it, we brought people to our classroom and we taught them. And that was always my biggest challenge with traditional academia, is I'm like, that doesn't work. That's not how people learn. They need to do something with it. And so I sold them on the fact that I said, I don't want to mess that up, because I knew I'd get into a political turf war if I came in and said, I'm changing all your stuff. But I said, I can make it better with technology. And so I said, I can augment what you're doing. And so they bought it. They're like, okay, yeah, it sounds good. It wasn't threatening. It was this different new thing. But then when I came in, the reality is you can't just throw technology at the same way you're doing things. So in terms of what I do now, a lot of it, and maybe I think teachers can probably relate to this a lot, because I dealt with this even with parents. People don't really know what we do. They don't understand it. They're like, so you just tell people stuff, right? It's like, no, that is actually not what we do. And so there's a big misunderstanding in corporate, just like there is in academia, of what exactly it is we do. And so a lot of my time is just helping business leaders understand how education works, how learning works. And the challenge is the former kind of K-12 model has actually made it challenging for being in corporate learning, because the initial response from every business leader when they have a problem is, well, let's train it. Let's have a workshop and we'll tell everybody what they should do, and then they'll go back, because that's what they remember. They're like, well, when I went to school, I went to the class and then I went home. And so a big part of that is helping business leaders understand the psychology and the neurology behind how do people actually learn through experiences and through things like that. So honestly, a lot of it is just educating business people on the way things happen. So that's a good chunk of my time. Another good chunk of my time is actually building out and architecting the learning journeys for people. And that's, I think, something that teachers that if you got into teaching because you liked helping people learn, I think instructional design is something teachers would just get a kick out of. Now, training's another route. So you have to look at, if you're a teacher, you have to look at, do I like being in front of people and facilitating, or do I like designing and kind of creating what that looks like? Because you can go in either path. And so that's where I kind of moved away from the being in front of people and doing that. I've kind of gotten back into it, but more into the design of, I was always fascinated by, what does the journey look like? Where should people be? Milestones along the way. And so I do a lot of that now. And then the other part is really, I invest a lot of my time looking at how is technology changing that. I don't necessarily fault the classroom. For years, that's all we had. That's all we had. That's all we really could do. I mean, yeah, there was distance ed where you like mailed in your stuff, but we didn't really have that. And now with video conferencing and these platforms that are completely changing social learning and allowing people to connect differently, we can do all the things that we were trying to do in the classroom completely differently than we could before. So that's, I mean, if somebody were to follow me for a day, that's kind of a combination of what I'd be doing.
That's awesome. And I have to touch on, it's a little off topic, but not really at the same time. Just an example potentially for people that are listening, on our prior call, and I've actually told this story quite a few times to other people. On our prior call, I was using the webcam and trying to get more comfortable with it. And I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but you explained to me how you had started working on a team. It was a remote team, and
Yep.
you were always, you guys met virtually like this,
Yeah.
with multiple people, and you had your webcam on, but nobody else did.
Yep.
And then you went into an office to meet. Do you want to tell the story, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, and that's not even the only time this has happened, but yeah, exactly it. So I always have had my webcam on because even back when I was doing the medical software thing, I was remote, and I hated the fact that some of the team was in the office, and I always felt like a second-class citizen. It drove me nuts. And so I swore when I was in charge, I would always be on webcam so no one ever felt the way I did. And I did just that. When I took over, I turned my webcam on and I told my teams, you're going to do it. And so I've always done that. And then at GE, I did it and people thought I was nuts. They're like, you're crazy. And I'm like, I'm not turning it off. But so the example that you're telling it was a big project I was leading, and I was for 6 or 8 weeks. I was the only person, the lone wolf. So I had to get really used to the fact that I'm just looking at myself in a black box. But yeah, we had a meeting in Chicago, and I walked in, and multiple people came up and gave me a hug and were like, oh my gosh, Christoper, it's so good. I had no idea who they were, and just kind of awkwardly did like the, hey, you. And it was that moment that they clicked and they went, I get it. Like, I realize now you have no idea who I am. And I feel like I know you as if you sit across the hall from me. And that was when people really started believing like this actually does make a difference. So.
Sorry, I was on mute for a second.
No.
It's been a huge, powerful story for me, because I started right around that time. I was starting to use the webcam more often, and I was one of the ones that would kind of use it a little bit more, but I wasn't near as bold as you were. So you helped encourage me to be more bold with it, and just realize, if I don't have my makeup done, if I don't have my hair done, it's the authentic me, whatever, who cares? And it took a while. And so when I talk to people about it now, they're like, what? And I don't know if I've helped encourage other people, but it is amazing and so powerful how much this can add to a relationship, a conversation, and just understanding. And I think this is one of the ways that just with education, technology, learning, remote workforce, that I think we can go into more. I know it's a little off topic, but just have to add that in there. And it's, yeah.
Well, and I think that's right. That's probably one of the biggest things that can be a challenge for teachers jumping into this, is because, and I don't know how it is, it's been a long time, but I did my grad work not that long ago, and we still are training teachers about the classroom. Like, that's still the way teachers are classically trained. And I get it, right? K-12 is starting to, there's more online distance ed stuff that's coming, but there's still a little bit, back in that still different model. And so that can be hard for teachers to be like, wait, though, but the class, like, isn't that where things need to be? And it's like, look at what you were doing in the classroom that was really effective. And then look at how can we do that? Because that's the part the technology is changing. And yeah, this is a This is a perfect example. I mean, I've been at GE for 3 years and people are like, oh, do you travel? I haven't traveled once because I can connect with who I need to connect with and get done what I need to get done just as effectively as if actually more effectively in my opinion, because I can't be everywhere all at the same time versus I can be everywhere all at the same time this way. So.
And I think I just listened to, we'll also talk about, I'll put information on your new podcast, Learning Tech Talks.
Yep.
So I just listened to your session, and to this point of what we're talking about now with the webcam and technology, I loved how you guys mentioned, I think it was you or altogether you were discussing how so many times technology, learning, digital learning, whatever it is you call it, now has a bad rap because people will take and bundle, their in-person training, throw it online and be like, oh, that's crap, that sucks, we shouldn't do it. And I think the big thing that teachers can bring, because we understand how people learn, is it's not about the technology that's being used, it's about how it's actually being used within there and how it's designed. So I actually had my entire master's degree was an all online master's degree, and I feel like it was such an amazing experience because I feel like the online course learning platform and the way they designed everything and the activities they had us do and the doing rather than the telling was a much better experience than many other experiences I've had in in-person classes. And I think it's hard for some people, like I know some teachers who don't understand or can't gather the online learning side, but I think very important point is it's the technology is the aid to get there, and it can be a much better experience when done correctly. Right.
Well, and honestly, that's where you just mentioned it, and I completely agree. This is where teachers can help bring this because, like I said earlier, people who aren't teachers don't understand what teachers do. So they just see the thing and they're like, you taught. But teachers and educators, we can deconstruct that. We can break that down and say, no, there's a lot more going on than this. There's this, which is accomplishing this. We're doing this, that's accomplishing. So we can actually deconstruct what's happening. And that's what I think that's honestly what's allowed me to be really effective in digital learning, because I've been able to say this part of it is doing this, and this can be done with technology. This part right here, it can't, because that has to do with the way humans are interacting with one another, and we can't mess that up. So this component we have to preserve, and we'll preserve it this way, but this component, it doesn't. And only somebody who truly understands learning and education, and that's the skill set we bring to the table, is the ability to deconstruct that. Everybody else is just looking at it as this one universal thing and going, oh, that's teaching, that's learning. And you're like, no, that's actually a super complex, multifaceted thing. You're only seeing the front end of it.
Awesome. Very good. We can keep going a little longer, but I guess my overall question now left for you is, what advice, and I know we've offered a lot of advice throughout what we talked about, but do you happen to have any like closing words or advice or anything you want to add for a teacher who possibly is in the shoes that we were once in and not sure what to do?
So couple things. We probably have had this whole conversation just on this question, but a few things really pop to mind. I mean, one, there are so many resources out there now. Even if a teacher's not 100% sure that they maybe want to get out or they want to go do something different, I would encourage them to just learn about it, connect with other people. Because the other thing that I think one of the challenges I had when I was in teaching was I felt really isolated. I felt like the only people I could relate to were other teachers, and so, yeah, it was a community, but when I connected with people from the corporate world, I just felt like I don't really understand what you do anyway. And learning more about corporate learning and development actually teaches you a lot about the business world. And so it can really help kind of build your social circles anyway. And it's fascinating. And I think, if you got into education because that's something you're interested in, you won't be like, this is boring or dumb. You'll actually get a lot of value out of it. And who knows where that will take you. Maybe it'll keep you in the classroom, but change the way you're thinking about it and give you different ideas. Because that's the thing. I think there's this perception that, oh, the academic world's here and corporate's here. And it's like, no, we're on the same team. And I actually learn a lot from, I found Kahoot through a friend of mine who's a teacher. He's like, my kids love it. They think it's a great game. I'm like, great. I can use that in corporate. And so we share best practices across. So I don't ever think, I think people get into education because they like learning. I don't think you'll ever be disappointed by learning more about it, and it's only going to help you. I think the other thing that I would say is, you know, understand that going into corporate learning can mean literally anything. That's one of the things that I loved most about going the corporate side versus, academic was in the K-12 classroom. I kind of felt like I had no choice but to be the jack of all trades, because that was it. It was my classroom. I had to be the instructional designer. I had to be the facilitator. I had to be, I had to do it. I had to go buy my own freaking supplies, things like that were like, oh, I can't really focus on the things that I really love doing. I just kind of have to do it all. And in the corporate world, you could literally specialize. If you're creative and you love design, you could truly just be a graphic designer in learning and development and do nothing more than that. You could do, so that's where you get a chance to really specialize in it. And I think a lot of people coming out of it don't understand how diverse that space is. I didn't when I first got in. I thought, well, if you go into training, that means you go train, you stand in front of people and you deliver classes. And it's like, nope. It is a huge world. So I think that's where that whole advice to get to know people, learn more about it, you'll be amazed at how diverse and widespread it is. And I think the thing that is great advice for teachers, regardless of whether they want to pull the ripcord completely or not, is understanding that can open up doors to augment what you're doing in the classroom. Like becoming an independent consultant now is so easy. I mean, pay $200 to ink file, get an LLC, and you're a consultant. Like that's it. And so if you get into this space, you may not have to give up teaching. You may still be able to do teaching how you want, but then you can moonlight in the summers or, whatever, because the thing is people, as remotes being more allowed, like people don't really care. You literally could do corporate consulting and teaching. And now that, kind of frustrating financial ceiling that you deal with in being a teacher, you can blow the lid off that. And maybe you never leave it, but maybe now you augment it. And instead of trying to find coaching jobs in the summer or picking up a side gig or things like that, you can just be an educational consultant. So I guess those are kind of all interconnected.
No, I think that's great. Those are all wonderful, great pieces of advice I think people would find very, very helpful and useful. And I like your approach and how you come about things and thinking about things. So thank you very much for that. So
no problem.
Well, if you don't have anything else to add, those are the main things I wanted to touch on. It's probably a little around 40 minutes, I think now. So okay. If there's nothing else you have to add, I want to make sure if anybody wants to contact you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
My email address and my phone numbers change all the time. So honestly, LinkedIn, I'm on it a lot. So if people want something or just want to connect or follow or chat, LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of me. And if I don't get back to people right away, it's just because I get so many messages and stuff like that. But I'm always open to collaborating with folks. So yeah, LinkedIn is the best way.
Okay. And also your podcast, Learning Tech Talks. Can you give us a quick little overview of that really fast?
Yeah. So Learning Tech Talks is the genesis of really the culmination, I think, of my entire career, which is helping big corporations and honestly teachers probably to understand what this technology is out there and how do you use it well. Because the point you brought up earlier, digital learning gets a really bad rap because we've made some colossal mistakes along the way. And so when people think digital learning, they think, oh, you took this really cool, engaging classroom session and you packed it into a click and read PowerPoint e-learning. And it's like, that's not what digital learning is. And so this whole podcast is about talking to providers that are doing cool things, but not just talking about it from the bells and whistles. Wow, isn't that neat? But digging beneath the surface into like, what is this? How do we deconstruct education and where does this fit? What does it do? When does it make sense? When does it not? And if you're going to do it, what do you need to do to be successful with it? And so, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think, you've heard one. I think the conversations are just entertaining in general. Maybe I'm biased, but yeah, that's what Learning Tech Talks is. And last week was our first one. I got another one tomorrow. So.
Awesome. Perfect timing on me reaching out to you to do this interview. So
yeah, perfect.
So, all right. Well, I will go ahead and post the link to your podcast and to your LinkedIn when I post this up for everybody. And thank you so, so much for your time. I'm sure people, anybody who watches this will find this very, very beneficial. So thank you again so much. And have a great rest of the day.
All right. You too. Thanks, Carrie.